Today we are joined by Dr. Michael Rossino, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Malloy College. His research and teaching focuses mostly around issues of race and ethnicity, stratification, politics, media, collective action, crime, law and deviance, and human rights. And his work has appeared in academic journals such as Social Currents, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and Ethnic and Racial Studies. His most recent research examines how the participants of a progressive grassroots party in the Northeast engage with issues of racial and political inequality through their identities, habits, and political strategies. And that's a multi-site ethnographic case study concurrent with the 2016 election. His first book, Debating the Drug War, Race, Politics, and the Media, investigates mass and digital media into debate over drug policy and demonstrates the influence of political ideologies and identities, the omission of racial justice concerns, the use of implicit racial meanings, and identity construction through racial discourse. And I believe that that is going to be the topic of today's talk. So with no further waiting, I'm going to pass over to you now, Michael.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Meji, for the wonderful introduction. I'm very delighted to be here. So I am a professor at Malloy College in New York. Coming to you from beautiful Brooklyn, New York right now. It's about 7:30 a.m. my time. So please give me that context that the time difference is going to make a little bit of a difference. But my excitement to be here is kind of carrying through this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my book that came out in March called Debating the Drug War. Race, Politics, and the Media. And really, I just put this slide in because this is my first book. This is my second year as a tenure track professor. So it's a nice way of pumping myself up. I didn't think I would ever be able to write and publish a book. And I'm currently working on some future book projects as well. So I'm excited to talk about those as well. If anyone wants to talk about it, I think you got a little preview in my introduction of some of the other things that I'm working on. So to start off, what really got me interested in this project was thinking about some of the massive public opinion changes and reforms that have taken place in the United States over about the past decade. If you were to ask political opinion and political attitude researchers in the United States, what are some of the major policy issues that have really changed in terms of public opinion? The most, I would say, probably what you would hear is that the two biggest are support for same-sex marriage, which resulted in massive changes in laws that have legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states in the United States. And probably a close second would be support for drug policy reform, specifically legalizing or decriminalizing many drugs such as cannabis. And even in some places, there has been massive support for legalizing hallucinogenic drugs, as well as just overall policy reforms. And I can remember it was probably about 2013, 2012, when I first started to see the headlines that demonstrated that now a critical mass, the majority of people in the United States, supported legalizing cannabis for the first time in US history. And that information really took me aback because I had so many conversations with friends and colleagues throughout my life about drug policy in the United States. That I really thought, maybe we need to be focusing as much on this public debate and public conversation, how people are thinking about and talking about drug policy reform, as much as talking about the actual policies themselves, which obviously have a deep social and political importance. So I became really interested in approaching the war on drugs as something that is increasingly unpopular in the United States. It still persists as sort of a system. And by the war on drugs, what I mean is a racialized and militarized approach to drug policy enforcement. that tends to target marginalized racial and class communities, and also tends to use military tactics in order to enforce those laws. What I think is so interesting about the war on drugs in particular as a space of debate and contestation is that despite the fact that the war on drugs is deeply unpopular and that most people would have a negative opinion of the war on drugs in the United States, it still remains a contested social issue, meaning that despite the seeming consensus that seems to be captured by information showing this public opinion shift, there still remains a deep and complicated conversation and debate about sort of the how or why of some of these policy reforms. What exactly is it about the war on drugs that people find problematic, and what do they want to do about it? That is still a space that is being shaped and reshaped in US society through spaces like politics and the media. And so I wanted to see the public debate on the war on drugs as what Herbert Blumer in 1971 calls a process of collective definition. And what he meant there was that when we study social problems as sociologists, it's not enough to just study the problem itself, its objective features, or to look at the empirical data about the extent to a problem. It's not necessarily enough to let the public sort of pick and choose what are social problems that sociologists should be studying, but that we should also be focusing on the process whereby certain issues and trends become defined as problems. How do things become problematized? And so with that kind of framework in mind, I was really fascinated in this topic for that reason. And I do apologize for my cat in the background, but for anyone that follows me on Twitter, you probably know that they're probably pretty unhappy with me for locking them out of the room. But this is one of the benefits of doing this remotely. You get the full experience of my cats meowing in the background. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this project was to not only understand the contemporary discussions and debates that are taking place in the United States around drugs and drug policy, but I also wanted to historicize this issue so that I could understand what were some of the patterns and processes that we've seen over the actually centuries-long history of drug prohibitions in the United States. And one of the things that I found particularly surprising and interesting as I started looking into the historical record is, although we often think of the war on drugs in the United States as sort of this formally a product of the 1970s and 1980s, we kind of have this idea that Ronald Reagan declared the war on drugs when he gave his famous speech in the early 1970s. Ronald Reagan came along and signed bills in the early 80s that increased military collaboration with police and sort of made certain definitions that were deeply racialized of the drug problem embedded into law. Is that actually the first drug prohibitions in the United States actually go all the way back to the early 1870s. In the early 1870s, there was a growth and influx of Chinese immigration to the United States, primarily on the West Coast. A lot of it had to do with the expansion of railways and new industries opening up. At the same time, this Chinese immigration was also being accompanied by racist moral panics that was part of a larger social and political trend that was taking place known as the Yellow Menace or the Yellow Scare that sought to sort of dehumanize and exclude people of Chinese origin from being part of the United States public. So around this time, you actually saw the first official citizenship laws in the United States with the Chinese Exclusion Act that actually excluded an entire pan-ethnic group or an entire nationality from actually immigrating into the United States. So at the same time that this racist moral panic is taking place, it also becomes attached to fears around specifically opium dens that Chinese migrants were opening up and operating in places like California. And these places, these opium dens were seen by many whites, particularly white elites, as places which had a particular moral hazard for society because they lended themselves to race mixing, meaning that it was a place where a lot of white commentators at the time, media elites or elites in different areas of society like politics, were concerned about middle-class whites entering into these spaces where they were seen to have lascivious activities, whether it was ideas that there was going to be immoral sexual activity or drug use and addiction. This was part of the larger framework that was used to engage in this racist moral panic. So I got some headline or some quotes here from newspapers in California in the mid 1870s. So one in the LA Herald says these Mongolian death pens are no doubt great promoters of vice and disease. In the Weekly Butte Record, which is another California paper, we have in the dens alluded to, Chinese and whites, male and female, gather together and worship the god of opium on the plane of perfect equality, their sole object being to get drunk and stupefy themselves by inhaling the fumes of the narcotic poison. And I think one of the things that really comes through here is not only that this is an early instance in American history and US history of a moral panic being deeply racialized and mobilized against a specific group, but also that this is something that echoes throughout US history, and I think in the history of a lot of other nations who have passed drug prohibition laws, which is that these types of racist or racialized moral panics continue to buttress drug prohibitions and racialized enforcement even to today with shifting targets. In the US, this can be seen with the connections that were drawn between everything from Catholic and Jewish ethnic groups and alcohol use, along with the short-lived alcohol prohibition in the United States, to the outlawing of powder cocaine in the aftermath of the Civil War in the early 1920s, and how that was used to target and criminalize free Blacks after the end of the Civil War, as well as the connections that were drawn by media elites and moral entrepreneurs between Mexican immigrants in the United States and the use of cannabis, which at the time was referred to as marijuana, derivatively in a way to connect it with migrants from Mexico, to demonize them, as well as to present different racial and ethnic groups as potential threats to the white middle class. So we can see, as many scholars have concluded, that drug prohibition and its cultural representations are embedded in a racialized system of control. This is something that not only I've shown in some of my work, but there's obviously a vast literature on this. Many people are probably familiar with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, where she also highlights a lot of these issues as well. And so looking back at this history, what I wanted to understand is, given that there has been this drastic change in public opinion, given that there is kind of a new consensus that's being formulated in terms of drug policy in the United States, how does that necessarily connect to or relate back to some of these historical trends? So in order to understand the contemporary debate on drug policy in the United States, I conducted an in-depth content analysis. So I drew from the LexisNexis archive, which is a large archive of documents, everything from newspapers to legal documents. I was able to pull about 394 newspaper manuscripts that included everything from op-ed pieces, letters to the editor, journalistic reporting, just about anything that discussed or talked about the war on drugs as a drug policy strategy. The timeline that I drew it from was 1983, which kind of marks the very early years of the formalized period of the war on drugs in the United States, the early stages of the Reagan administration, to 2014, which was about when I started this project. So this should give you a good sense of just how long it's taken me to go from starting this research project to actually having my book out. I recently actually looked at the proposal and it said it would be out in 2016, which really made me laugh. But just to give, especially for graduate students, a sense of how patient sometimes you have to be with these projects, just keep that in mind. I also did something which was maybe a bit masochistic, but ultimately kind of proved to be a useful resource for this project, which was I also collected about 3,145 comments from online news articles on the war on drugs as well. Obviously, my time frame was a little bit more limited to 2011 to 2014, given that obviously there wasn't online news comments or online articles back in 1983. This was about as close as I could get to trying to understand how different arguments and claims kind of resonate or receive reception from various types of audiences. So this also became a really useful resource for my analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well as I'm discussing my findings. I definitely would say that I read 3,000 online comments for this project, so no one would ever have to again. So please, keep that in mind. I still go with the don't read the comments. Maybe when the YouTube video of this comes up, I will definitely not read the comments. But it's very useful if you can actually get a book project out of it and publish off of it for any intrepid media sociologists out there. And essentially, I applied this approach called ethnographic content analysis, which is just really focusing on identifying patterns of meaning in the basic ethnographic sense. So I identified frames, themes, and discourses, and that kind of undergirds my analysis. I think for anyone who's had a conversation about drug policy, and I would assume it's probably no different in the UK in terms of some of these dominant frames and ideas that are mobilized. I think probably a lot of you in the audience are going to be familiar with a lot of these major frames. What I identified was the major frames that were used to critique the war on drugs in newspapers. So among arguments, among statements that are basically advocating against the militarized approach of the war on drugs or advocating for drug policy reform, what were the main claims that they were making to try to argue or support that? I think particularly these four right here are ones that if you've even ever had a conversation about drug policy with friends or family, you're probably familiar with. The first one is the fiscal frame. This is essentially just the argument that drug policy, in the way that it currently exists, both prevents massive tax revenue from coming into local and larger governments, state governments, federal governments, due to the fact that the drug markets as they currently exist are not generating tax revenue. And also the idea that it impacts productivity overall, that it would create an economic boon for there to be legal drug industries that exist. I think this is a pretty familiar argument, and actually just when New York recently passed their drug policy reforms, this was one of the leading arguments that was mobilized by some of the political leaders here. Another one that I think a lot of people are familiar with is the overall sort of idea of freedom and justice. This is not necessarily about any type of specific group inequality, but more about the types of claims that you are likely to encounter that focus on things like bodily autonomy, sort of the right to consume whatever you want to consume, maybe broadly libertarian approaches to drugs and drug use that basically would say something along the lines of people should have the ability to, express their liberty, to consume drugs because, that's part of their freedom, or even just pointing out that there are hypocrisies within drug laws. I think a lot of us grow up in societies where alcohol, for instance, is deeply normalized and vindicated, even as sort of like a coming of age sort of substance. And at the same time, there's this often observation that cannabis, which is likely less harmful based on medical research, is treated as something that is criminal and stigmatizing. So even just pointing out those paradoxes, I think kind of broadly falls under this frame. And I think a lot of us, like I said, are familiar with those. I go in depth into the book. I'm also happy to talk about those a little bit more in the Q&A if anyone wants to touch on those. But really, today I want to highlight two outliers in my analysis that I think tell us a lot about the role of racial politics in this debate. The first one is what I call the functionalist frame. This was the most common by a landslide, about 4 times as common as the fiscal frame. And essentially, I think this will also be familiar to people, which is essentially just drawing on the idea of functionalism in sociology, kind of a crude version of Durkheim or Parsons, the idea that the war on drugs is problematic because it has failed to do the manifest functions. It has failed to actually live up to the manifest functions that it has set for itself. So oftentimes you'll hear about how the war on drugs is a failure, that it has failed in its mission, or that it is broadly dysfunctional, that it is failing to achieve its manifest goals, which in this case would be reducing drug-related crimes or reducing drug use, reducing the supply and flow of drugs. This is such a common critique that actually the famous satirical newspaper, The Onion, released a headline in the early 2000s that actually they declared that drugs had officially won the war on drugs. So it's even gotten to the level of like satire and how people talk about the war on drugs in a comedy sense. So that was the most common. Another sort of interesting outlier is that discussions of racial disparities broadly construed in the war on drugs were actually constituted the least common frame. And I think, given the sort of the renewed sort of attention placed on racial injustice and racial oppression, particularly around the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly around the rise of people thinking a little bit more critically about criminalization and the relationship between racial oppression and the legal system. I think that can be somewhat counterintuitive. For sociologists and others that study sort of contemporary racial discourse, it might be a little bit less surprising, given some of the research out there on sort of how white people in particular are oftentimes likely to avoid overtly discussing race and racism. So let's get into sort of some of the more specific findings so we can kind of look at the role that racial politics, broadly speaking, kind of plays in the debate. The first kind of overall trend that I think is really important is what I call racial silence, meaning that despite the fact that it is deeply established, there is a growing consensus among not only activists, but also policy researchers, criminologists, sociologists, and legal scholars, that the war on drugs and the majority of drug policies, mass incarceration connected to the war on drugs, is part of a larger system of racialized social control, that it's connected to structural racism, that it reproduces racial inequalities. Only about 8.7% of claims critical of the war on drugs even evoked any type of discussion of race or racism at all. And here I'm not saying 8% of the manuscripts, but actually 8.7% of the overall claims and arguments. Of those, only 2% of claims focused on structural or systemic racism. So pointing out that there's something about the way that institutions are arranged and the way that that group interests are manifesting that is resulting in some type of disparity or inequality. What I really noticed when I looked into the specific types of claims and discourses that were taking place within this frame is that there was a fixation overall within the overall disparity rather than the social processes that produce that disparity. So it's pretty much considered sort of common knowledge that there are these racial disparities, that certain groups are more likely to experience arrest and incarceration, particularly Black and Latinx communities are much more likely to experience criminalization, much more likely to be incarcerated, and much more likely to be arrested for drug-related crimes. And one of the things that this focus on disparity it does is that it is simultaneously silent on how the actual policies and practices of the war on drugs cause racial inequality and maintain structural racism. So even the arguments against the war on drugs that are evoking ideas of race and racism are merely noting that there is some type of disparity going on. So in the Washington Post, someone noted that in one particular state, I believe this is in New Jersey, that Blacks are sent to prison on drug charges at a rate 21 times greater than whites. And we can see here how there were even attempts to sort of explain this disparity that didn't actually look at the institutions or policies themselves, but maybe saw it more as an artifact of maybe community differences or different practices between racial groups. So the author of this Washington Post piece points out that inner city drug dealers tend to congregate on the street, not indoors as in more affluent suburbs where the bulk of illegal substances is actually consumed. So attempting to explain this disparity without actually looking at the perverse incentives that the carceral system might have to target certain communities, or looking at the way that the system itself is set up to advantage and disadvantage certain groups. It's merely just an artifact of how people use and sell drugs. There's also an implicit assumption here that I'm sure a lot of you have picked up on, that it assumes that in the inner cities is where drugs are sold, whereas the suburbs are where substances are consumed, kind of creating this disparity of how we imagine suburban and inner city crime that's already deeply racialized. And then there was a comment in response to one of the newspaper articles that discussed this disparity that I think encapsulates sort of the overall thinking here pretty well, which is regardless of anyone's opinion on this topic, can we at least agree that the racial numbers, 1 out of 15 Black versus 1 out of 106 whites incarcerated, tell us that something is definitely wrong with this picture. So it's kind of this broad idea. We have this outcome, which seems problematic, but there's not any discussion about the processes or mechanisms. And what that lent itself to in terms of decoding, and here I'm kind of using decoded in the same sense of Stuart Hall in terms of the process of encoding and decoding, drawing from media studies, is commenters oftentimes decoded messages about racial disparities, these messages that said, okay, this disparity exists, therefore the war on drugs is problematic, as actually being outcomes of inherent differences in traits between groups, or in terms of using that actual disparity to depict the so-called drug problem in racist terms. And here we can see the emergence of a lot of racialized code words being employed to sort of evade the use of direct racial descriptions, but to actually sort of try to connect these various social problems and threats, with racial groups. And here I'm kind of also drawing on some of the research that's come out of political science in the United States on group-based frames, where political scientists have, for instance, found that if you give out a survey and ask people on average about inner city crime, they will have largely different responses than if you simply ask them about crime, and that those responses map really closely to racial attitudes and racial ideologies. So more racially conservative survey respondents are more likely to say that we should have a punitive response to inner city crime versus crime, whereas more racially liberal or even racially progressive respondents are likely to see less of a difference. So some of these quotes here kind of give us a sense of the racial logic that undergirds sort of this form of decoding. One here says, gangs will be out of business, little street corner punks would be out of business, courts would be freed up to prosecute real crime, and prison costs would be less than what we are paying now to house these drug prisoners. Another commenter said, dealers are violent criminals by their nature. They aren't otherwise innocent people. They don't care who overdoses and dies on their crack. Their business is the reason that domestic terrorists, street gangs infest our city centers. So both of these have some real consistent sort of features in common. The idea of equating the drug problem with ideas of the inner city, with ideas of organized violence, with the idea particularly of organized violence and crimes that are then associated with people of color in particular, particularly in working class and poor communities. And what is especially interesting when we think about the similarities of the logic in these two quotes is that actually these two commenters are actually arguing different points. So the first one is arguing that we should reduce the punitive approach to the war on drugs, while the second one is actually arguing that we should increase the punitive approach to the war on drug policy. So there's even a seeming consensus about the racial framing and racially coded sort of communication, even among people who disagree about overall drug strategy, as a way of decoding these messages about racial disparities. I also noticed that from another perspective, there's also some opposition to some of the critical claims that are made, oftentimes that small 2% of claims that are criticizing society or institutions at large. So for instance, a letter to the editor who identified himself as white, the author of this letter to the editor was responding to an op-ed in a local newspaper that essentially attempted to point out that the war on drugs is sort of engaging in structural or systemic racism. He says Pitt was fine up to the point where he decided to pull out the race card. I have to disagree with him when he says that the war on drugs has been, in effect, a war on Black men. Please let's stop having one group of people or another blaming others for misfortunes they have largely brought upon themselves. It's important for the young people of all races to stay in school, get a job, and resist the gang life. In my view, people should learn to live their own lives without blaming everyone else for their circumstances. So for those of you that are familiar with recent work on contemporary racial ideology, like Eduardo Bonilla Silva's influential Racism Without Racists, you might start to identify some of these as what sociologists often call colorblind racial ideology, meaning that it is a way of explaining racial inequality in a way that supports the status quo or prevents racial progress or racial justice, using ideas that come from sort of the post-civil rights period in the United States, where overtly defending racial inequality and racial injustice is now stigmatized. So you have these ideas that it is actually the behaviors or cultural deficiencies of different racial groups that explain these disparities, that it's actually about things like lack of work ethic or being tempted to join a criminal organization, the idea that people are solely responsible for their outcomes in life, and the idea that it is racist to even discuss race. So in some ways, we also see that discussions of the disparity that do make these sort of critical claims also oftentimes encounter resistance from this sort of contemporary dominant framing about race and racism as well. I also want to spend some time talking about the functionalist frame, which, as I mentioned, was the most common frame that was used to critique the war on drugs. Broadly speaking, the functionalist frame presents the war on drugs as a failure. And this could include literally going with the metaphorical idea of having lost a war, which obviously the concept of war really creates a conceptual scaffolding for a lot of these debates to kind of hang on. Or just merely calling it the failed war on drugs, or saying the war on drugs has failed, or we've lost the war on drugs. So for instance, an op-ed written in the Freelance Star, which was a local newspaper, said, if World War II had been as unsuccessful as the war on drugs, we would all be speaking German right now and hiling somebody. Oftentimes there were these comparisons with actual military endeavors. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of the underside of this that I think we often don't see when we talk about this sort of common sense approach of saying the war on drugs has been a failure, which is such a common framing of this issue. One of the issues that I really saw come through, and one of the major trends in how these claims were made, is that oftentimes it wasn't simply that people were saying that the war on drugs is failing to control crime or failing to control drug use and drug distribution, but furthermore emphasizing the war on drugs as criminogenic, meaning it's something that is producing and amplifying criminality, either through the existence of illegal markets, often called black markets for drug use, or through the fact that there are criminal activities that are facilitated and taking place through that. What's fascinating, though, I think about this is that similarly to some of the claims that were decoding the racial disparities, these claims similarly took on racist code words as a way of discussing the particular threat of drug-related crime that is assumed to be escalated and amplified by punitive drug policy. So an op-ed in the Providence Journal said, the war on drugs enriches criminals and terrorists as drugs grow ever cheaper and more potent. In Forbes in 2012, someone wrote, the war on drugs developed local gangs into transnational enterprises with intricate power structures that reach into every corner of society, controlling vast swaths of territory with significant social and military resources at their disposal. Another op-ed in Forbes around the same time similarly said, come out of your ivory tower and get down to crack alley, essentially arguing that people who are interested in understanding the war on drugs empirically or understanding it from a perspective of what's truly going on or how groups are being impacted is missing this sort of overall threat and violence. Common within both comments along these lines as well as newspaper manuscripts along these lines were terms such as thugs and criminal empires, common thugs, illegal invaders, the Taliban and the terrorists of Al-Qaeda, and terrorists as well as drug cartels. Some commentators even proposed that there was a vast conspiracy that was taking place between low-level inner-city drug dealers, cartels, attempts to bring undocumented people into the United States from South and Latin America, and the Taliban and organizations in the Middle East. So kind of tying all of these tropes of like racialized bad guys all into one, and saying this represents the drug problem, so to speak. So we can already start to see some real parallels here. And we can already start to see some potential ways in which even among drug reform advocates, there is a consistent and dominant sort of racial logic that is leading to conclusions that almost assume that perhaps what makes the war on drugs dysfunctional is that it doesn't do enough, actually. It's not effective enough as a system of racialized social control, that it's actually not doing enough to marginalize and oppress groups that are seen as violent and threatening by the white majority and by political and cultural leaders that represent the white middle class or the white average person. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of what is the reality that is concealed from this debate. What is actually missing here? And I think this is where my project kind of is helpful, not only for thinking about understanding the debate, but for gaining some practical insights. So one of the things that is concealed through this sort of racial logic, through these frames, is that throughout the 20th century in the United States, whites were the primary users and traffickers of substances such as cannabis, opiates, and cocaine. And this is not merely because whites are the largest demographic group, but literally in terms of proportionality. Whites are the most likely to engage in these activities. And legal scholars have noted that for the last 20 years, whites have engaged in drug offenses at higher rates than blacks. So not simply, once again, just about the population makeup or the demographics, but actual rates per person of drug offenses. Similarly, we can start to understand some of these misconceptions by looking at some research that's been done by organizations such as the Sentencing Project, who found that whites consistently overestimate the crime rate among Black and Latinx populations in survey responses. They hold biases that implicitly connect these groups in their communities with crime and violence. So we can already see part of the actual empirical reality that is being obscured and concealed from the debate itself. Part of what we're also missing when we're only focusing on these disparities that's lending them to this sort of racist decoding is that there is now a consensus among experts that there is strong evidence of racial discrimination at almost every step of the policing, judicial, and criminal legal process. And that this discrimination accounts for more of the racial inequalities in drug arrests and imprisonment than the demographics of drug users or the demographics of producers and distributors. Researchers in Seattle have even gone so far as to actually stake out sort of like ethnographic research where they're actually observing the amount of drug sales that have taken place in certain open air spaces. And even that research identified, despite this myth about sort of who's more likely to sell drugs in open spaces, that the majority of people that they observed in this open air drug market in Seattle that were selling drugs were actually white, despite the majority of drug arrests in Seattle during that time being predominantly Black. We can also see how the drug policies themselves have had a disparate impact. So one really infamous law here in the United States was the sentencing disparity, where someone caught with powder cocaine will only receive 1 year in sentencing for 100 years for every gram of crack cocaine that someone is found with. And obviously there are differences in the affordability of these substances, but there's no actual difference in the chemical makeup. And this was buttressed by myths about crack cocaine that are along the lines of previous racialized moral panics, that there's something unique about crack rock cocaine that is making people criminally insane, that it is relating to bad motherhood and creating unique patterns of addiction among young people. And what's fascinating is that at the same time that these policies were being generated in the 80s and 90s, there was also a massive boom that was less discussed of powder cocaine usage among conservative middle-class suburbanites in the United States. That was kind of a more quiet crisis that didn't receive the same response. But obviously we can imagine these massive sentencing disparities have led to some of these outcomes, that it is actually a systemic issue. We also can see even the pipelines that are feeding people into the legal system reflect racial biases in drug policing. So police departments throughout the United States target predominantly poor and Black neighborhoods in enforcing drug laws for several reasons. One is in response from pressure to local economic elites to gentrify these neighborhoods. So there's a lot of research that when a neighborhood is gentrifying, when it's moving from a working class, oftentimes racially diverse neighborhood to a more homogeneously white middle or upper class neighborhood, that the police actually play a really strong role in displacing people, and that heavily targeted policing is oftentimes part of the gentrification process. Police are also obviously not distinct or separate from any one of us that is gaining implicit messages about drug problems from the media themselves. So the police are just as likely as any average citizen to have biases that come from the way that local drug problems are being shown by the media. As well as there is a very real fear that police departments face of the potential blowback from policing communities with higher political and economic capital. So we can imagine, for instance, I think about this in the context of like a university in the United States, but I think this kind of is like a fair comparison to maybe make with, a college or university in the UK, that here in the United States, there are fraternities where there is a massive sort of party culture. I think anyone who's engaged with sort of pop culture about the United States kind of has these images of like super party fraternities, college kids on spring break. This is where the majority of drugs, including, so-called hard drugs, this is where the majority of drug crimes, drug distributing is taking place in many college towns. If you actually wanted to purchase drugs and you were on a college campus, that would be a really great place to go. I think similarly in the UK, there are probably certain houses, whether they're on or off campus, where they're kind of known as party houses. And it might likely be the very sort of wealthy, intergenerational wealth sort of students that are actually participating in these. Yet we consistently see that even among campus police, there is much more of a fixation on policing sort of outsiders who are seen as the people who are bringing in drugs onto campus. There is much more of a focus of local police departments in college towns and neighborhoods on policing and attempting to arrest those in low income and oftentimes Black and Latinx communities. And part of that we can understand is just based on the potential for blowback. If it were that elites, whether they are young people coming from intergenerational wealth and political connection, or whether they are people who are, let's say, Wall Street executives and politicians, they're much more likely to not only have the resources needed to fight back and make sure that they're not convicted and to lower their rates of sentencing, thereby kind of defeating the purpose for police officers, but also they're likely to mobilize in order to actually change these laws to begin with. So perhaps if the war on drugs had been sort of instituted in an equal way, we might have already seen a lot of these drug laws already off the books and changed. So there's a lot of valid reasons why we see racial bias in policing. And we also see this overall pipeline of racial oppression. So racial discrimination amplifies the inequities in each stage. So white men charged with drug felonies are more likely to receive pretrial diversion and face probation rather than incarceration. So pretrial diversion means that they're less likely to even go to trial at all. White men convicted with drug crimes are more likely to receive drug treatment, while Blacks are more likely to receive prison time. In comparison to Blacks, whites receive shorter prison sentences for the same drug crimes. Prosecutors are more likely to suggest lower sentences for whites than Blacks. So we have evidence here of clear discrimination that has nothing to do with, this is controlling for types of drug crimes, controlling for criminal history. And overall, we can see how this reflects a racial empathy gap that we not only see in society, and we can even see this in the debate itself, but that's taking place in the legal system in the United States. A recent ethnographic study by Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve found patterns of racial discrimination and wrongful conviction throughout the the Cook County court system in the United States, which is one of the US's largest court systems. She actually had volunteers come and observe trials, like hundreds of volunteers to come and publicly observe trials and notice these massive patterns. And it overall represents this racial empathy gap. So it impacts who juries and judges identify as capable of experiencing suffering. It creates biases in sentencing and capital punishment. For those of you that have been paying attention to racial politics in the United States, there is currently a trial, the Rittenhouse trial, that's taking place, where we can kind of see this in happening right now, where because the defendant is a young white man, even though he's being accused of really horrific crimes, and there's a lot of evidence for it, you can watch in real time as the judge extends a great deal of empathy his way. So given that whites are more likely to be in positions of decision-making in courtrooms, empathy tends to be extended towards whites rather than Black or Latinx people in these circumstances. So I just want to wrap up. Haven't really been keeping track of the time, perhaps as well as I should. But I'm sure we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I just want to talk a little bit about the conclusions and implications here. So number one is that the framing has remained consistent. This is not only across drug policy reformers and those who are defending the status quo of drug policy, or perhaps asking for it to become more punitive, but also across newspaper types. So one of the things that happened when I went to publish some early articles from this project is that I had a reviewer actually asked to have me go back and recode my data. I was very annoyed because that's a lot of work to recode it on the basis of, like, is there a difference here between journalistic reporting, op-eds, letters to the editor, local newspapers versus high circulation newspapers? And particularly when it comes to these outliers that I mentioned, the dominant frame being dysfunctional and the least common frame being racial disparities, that was true across the board. There is a persistent racial silence and a persistent focus on dysfunction and pathology. One of the things that this allows me to really understand is some of the practices that drug policy reformers have engaged in. So drug policy reformers historically in the United States, and I think in other contexts, particularly as I've had conversations with drug reform organizations like Release in the UK, they have not really challenged racial injustice in a deep way. And they've oftentimes racialized drugs and drug use as a way of aligning with these racial empathy gaps rather than challenging them. So around the 80s and 90s, there was a real push from cannabis legalization organizations like NORML and the Marijuana Policy Project to depict cannabis users as sort of white, young, middle-class people who have a lot of promise. Oftentimes the idea was, okay, maybe these are veterans or college students who have been sort of ensnared in the legal system unjustly, who deserve a second chance. We also see this in terms of oftentimes how white drug abuse disorders are discussed, in terms of the idea of a white person who is perhaps middle class or working class. They have a lot of promise in their lives, and they were tricked by drugs or by drug dealers as these innocent victims. But we still see these common tropes of the idea that drug dealers are disproportionately represented as people of color, even in terms of discussions of like opiate use, that it's oftentimes doctors who are people of color that are oftentimes seen as these like drug peddlers rather than the people who are actually running pharmaceutical companies. And so what I would like to argue and see is that policy reformers can really take on a role as secondary institutional definers. And here I'm drawing once again on Stuart Hall's work on the media, particularly in Policing the Crisis, where he talks about how the relationship between the media and powerful institutions is that powerful institutions act as secondary institutional definers once reporters and media actors have sort of defined a certain definition, they then turn to experts and practitioners as a secondary way of defining sort of what's at stake, what matters, the problem at hand. Oftentimes, policy reformers and activists have sought frame alignment, meaning they've tried to align with these gaps, as we've seen with some of the things, whether it's the racial empathy gap or the racialization of drugs and drug crime. But I argue that experts and practitioners can really position themselves as agenda setting agents instead of frame alignment agents. Experts and practitioners that are critical of racial oppression and knowledgeable about these mechanisms need to have more influence among media and policymakers so that they can actually speak to these concerns and reshape the debate, and to emphasize de facto racism and the measurement of inequity and impact as an outcome of distinct processes. And what this really does is it not only creates a more robust and honest drug policy debate, but it actually creates more transformative and just drug policy. So for instance, in the state of New York, it's been kind of a surreal experience for me, because the day that my book actually came in the mail was the same day that cannabis was actually legalized here in New York. So that was kind of an interesting overlap. There was obviously a lot of celebrating in the city. And one of the things that the organizations that pushed for drug policy reform in New York did was that they strongly emphasized racial equity and racial justice, meaning that unlike a lot of other places where it was more of a libertarian approach of just like, let's legalize drugs and take a laissez-faire approach to, besides regulating some markets, there was a focus on decarceration, meaning that people were actually taken out of prison, that people had their criminal records expunged, that low-level drug offenses were also legalized. So it's common now to see people walking down the street smoking a joint, and that's not a crime anymore, given that that's how oftentimes racial disparities in arrests still happen in places where cannabis is legal. And that there was even a process put in place whereby the tax revenue generated by the cannabis market would actually be funneled into the communities that were disadvantaged and harmed by the war on drugs. So I'm hopeful that my research can sort of bolster not only a more robust and informed debate, but also better drug policy overall. And thank you for having me. I look forward to connecting and discussing my work further. I'm excited to hear the questions and talk to people. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that amazing presentation. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so I can see other people? Cool. Thanks so much for that presentation. It was a really great overview of some of the key debates that you're covering in your book and in your research. We've got just around half an hour now for some questions. So if you're watching on YouTube, please put your questions on the YouTube chat and I'll be checking it routinely. And you can also put your chat here into the Zoom. You can put your question here into the Zoom chat bar, or you can just raise your hand and I'll come to you. We have a first question then from, is it Naaman? Do you want to ask your question first?
Hello. I'm curious about media coverage in the US of the war on drugs on Mexico, and if that has had any impact. I mean, I grew up in San Diego, right on the US border, on the Mexican border, and it seems that with the exception of very few high-profile events like El Chapo escaping from prison, or maybe dozens of people being beheaded, it seems like the war on drugs in Mexico, despite its scale, intensity, and violence, is almost a non-issue. And I'm wondering if you agree with that assessment, or if it actually has had an impact.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because I think this is an actual dilemma that a lot of drug policy reformers face, which is on one hand recognizing that the war on drugs has been a catalyst for violence in places like Mexico with cartels and issues like that. And I think that basically what I saw in my data set, at least around this, is that there wasn't a lot of exact discussion about drug-related violence in Mexico, so much as there was concern using some of these racialized code words that I discussed about sort of the idea of drug smuggling, or the idea that violent Mexican cartels are going to infiltrate the United States. So what I ended up seeing is that it kind of fed into the racialized moral panic. What I didn't actually see was a lot of outpouring of empathy and concern for the issues with violence in the United States. And there's obviously a really complicated history there of the US's intervention in domestic politics in Latin America, how that's oftentimes bolstered and given rise to regimes that are extremely violent, or has favored certain types of social conditions related to violence. And so I really didn't see a lot of that. I think that one of the times that we really did see that kind of explode in the United States was kind of unfortunately after I completed my study. I'm sure that you probably remember as someone from the United States that there was this big sort of moral panic around, I would say it's around 2015, 2016, 2017, specifically around the so-called the migrant caravan, and as well as around the idea of MS-13, which is a Salvadorian gang that sometimes exists in US prisons. And that those were kind of used as specters a lot of times by right-wing politicians. And that did sort of influence some of the debate about drug policy as well on both sides, and kind of reinvigorate this specter of racialized moral panic. But I think in terms of like actual concern for the well-being of people who reside in Mexico or something along those lines, I didn't really see that taking place as a reason to sort of change drug laws that was really mobilized. And as I said, this is something that I think drug policy reformers grapple with, which is how to discuss this violence without reinscribing these racialized code words. And that's something that I've kind of been thinking about and working with them. So yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the questions. Thanks so much for dealing with it, Michael. Next, we have a question from Awa. Awa, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for that discussion. It was really insightful. I was really interested in your sort of methodological approach. In particularly, you talked about the comments that you use from the online articles. It sounds really tedious, but it was really interesting to hear. And you conducted this between 2011 and 14. I was just wondering, obviously so much has changed since then, especially in terms of online activism, public debates around certain topics on race in particularly. You mentioned that sort of the framing has remained consistent throughout the years, but do you think that we're seeing the framing changed a little bit now?
I think it's really interesting what's going on right now. I mean, I think that you all are experiencing sort of a parallel dynamic in the UK, where you have the rise of racial consciousness movements and the rise of movements against racial injustice that are kind of linked to this international struggle. I think around the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the very visceral response and mobilization around the murders of people like George Floyd, that I think necessarily rose the conversation. But what we're also seeing right now, I think in both contexts, is the rise of a new wave of racialized moral panic, specifically around the idea of, teaching or discussing systemic or structural racism. And so I'm not sure exactly how it would go in terms of dominant framing or the reception of audiences, but I would imagine that these issues of contestation around whether or not systemic racial discrimination exists, to what extent it can be proven. I would assume that those would continue to be wrapped up in this debate itself. And I think there would probably be further polarization, given that I think the rise of people's like awareness of these issues means that more and more people have very strong opinions about them, whether they have been perhaps maybe radicalized by some of the moral entrepreneurs on the right to buy into this sort of moral panic around critical race theory, or whether they have been sort of enlightened by the increased discussions of, issues around racial capitalism, police violence, carceral violence, colonialism, all these things being intertwined. I wonder to what extent that would really play out. I do think that given my conversations with drug policy reform organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance in the United States, the tide is certainly turning, I think, a little bit to where there is a younger generation of activists that deeply see the war on drugs and drug prohibition as a racial justice issue and are not afraid to address it on that front, which I think is a little bit of a sea change from the strategies that older, sort of more libertarian-minded organizations took, where they emphasize these other aspects. So I would be interested to see how that would change. I wouldn't be super surprised if there's much more of a discussion of racial disparities and much more of a discussion of sort of even acknowledging the systemic and structural issues at play. But I'm not sure, how the comment sections would go. I would be honest, I think they would probably be a lot more toxic. I think it would be even worse to do that research now. I remember it was like Christmas, the day before Christmas Eve, and I was reading all of these racist internet comments because I had a deadline to present at the ASAs, and I really had a moment where I was like, what am I doing with my life? So if anyone wants to study this now, definitely I want to say make sure you have a good support network, maybe mental health counseling, because it's pretty rough. But anyone who spent too much time on Twitter knows that like people's hot takes about these issues have gotten more extreme. Things have even gotten more polarized. So I think that's something that would come through, but I can't really speculate like how that would impact the overall shape of the debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks, Michael. Next, we have a question coming from Hannah.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I really kind of talk about a lot in the book, and I kind of got to it a little bit at the end, is this idea of there being a racial empathy gap. And I'm not the first person to propose that there's a racial empathy gap. Scholars like Eduardo Bonilla Silva and even like journalists have been talking about this for quite some time. But I think that really does play a big role in some of the dynamics that you just pointed out in terms of who's able to be seen as a victim, who's able to be seen as a perpetrator, in order to sort of mobilize empathy. I think that part of how this operates is that it is the idea that white people, white middle class people who are somehow involved in drug distribution or drug taking, that they are sort of these victims of these darker forces. And I mean that both in terms of color and in terms of like nefariousness, that it is sort of this idea that even goes back to the racial moral panics that I talked about that are like really old, the ones about there's a whole history in the United States specifically around some of the earliest attempts at pushing drug prohibition, that people like Harry Anslinger, who was one of the first sort of commissioners of an actual like drug prohibition agency, he himself wrote novellas and produced movies that overtly depicted Black and Latinx people and Asian people as sort of like pushing these exotic drugs onto white middle-class children, who then are getting caught up into this world of danger and crime and like there are still considered these innocent victims. And I think one of the things that's fascinating is we don't also consider how people who are ensnared in the carceral system, people who are selling and distributing drugs, maybe out of financial exigency, or maybe people who are using substances to cope with community trauma that's been inflicted because of structural oppressions. Like, these are all forms of victimhood that don't often have the same level of empathy mobilized toward them because of this empathy gap. So I think that is really fascinating, and I'm so excited to have these conversations with global audiences. I mean, the parallels are so fascinating to me, and I'm kind of excited to hear that there are, a lot of important activists and reformers in the UK that are looking at similar issues. So, I'm happy to connect with people as well. Thanks.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you can have studies like yours, which is so kind of contextualized in a very specific geopolitical location, but the themes you're talking about reverberate really transnationally. So it's always great to have people from outside of the UK coming to give talks. Naman actually has another question if no one else has anything. So for other people that have questions, please do raise your hands or put them in the chat. You can send them to me privately as well if you would like. In the meantime, Naman, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I'm curious if you've noticed a shift in popular culture and its coverage of war on drugs. I'm thinking of The Wire as perhaps the most notable example, but also Narcos or Narcos Mexico, and yeah, if you notice any trends in those.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I think about the juxtaposition between The Wire and even Breaking Bad and all of these shows that are about like drug crime, and the juxtaposition of how those characters are depicted and racialized to things like the various like stoner comedies and like stoner media that's really proliferated in the United States, where you often have these sort of like young white men who are potentially like held back from their true promise because, let's say, they're using too much cannabis, and it's just part of their like overall barriers and coming of age story. There's not really a huge sense that they're like menacing or difficult in some kind of way. Oftentimes we might get a media narrative that's about like white addicts who are like really struggling and being taken advantage of. Even to some extent, there's sort of this sense that like Breaking Bad is a narrative about like a middle-class white person who kind of gets ensnared in drug trafficking out of desperation, and he's kind of caught in this system with all of these threatening, violent organizations led by people of color. Even The Wire kind of, while it points out some of the dysfunctions of drug policy and some of the like nihilism that comes from it, obviously sort of depicts it in a way that deeply racializes the depiction of drug crimes. It very clearly says, the war on drugs is about inner city crime. And so I do notice that a lot of times in pop culture. I'm really fascinated by the way that when people don't have direct experiences with something, I don't know how many people in this room have ever, faced incarceration or been arrested for drug crimes. And I'm obviously not going to ask because that's none of my business. But because of that lack of direct experience, people are drawing on media. They're drawing on these cultural representations to even imagine and think through these issues. So I even think about, like, when I'm reading these debates, how much are people's imaginations around this issue, around what's possible, what's at stake, who are the players, how much is that also shaped by like fictional depictions that maybe is their closest thing of like, okay, this is what it's like to be a drug dealer. This is what prisons are like. This is how police think about this. And so there's a lot of power in media. I think that's really worth recognizing. In part of this process that I'm talking about of like the collective definition of a social problem, and even fictional media. So yeah, no, I definitely have seen that, and I think it's fascinating. I would love to see some type of fictional media that actually represents maybe activists or sort of more of the human rights struggle, or talks about maybe the sort of the actual like sort of underside of like suburban life and its complicity in this. So I think there's a lot more stories to tell, and I think people just need to get past the gatekeepers and tell them. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just going now to YouTube where we have another question now. Here's the question here. The US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. How do you think that liberals continue to legitimize these kind of social relations whilst basically giving the pretense that the US is basically the leader of world democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Big question.
That is a great question. I mean, I think that there is a lot there. So I'm going to try to kind of limit it to the scope of what I've seen in my work specifically, because I think there are some real scholars that have engaged with this in such a deep theoretical way, particularly people in like the Black radical tradition in the US and the Caribbean. I think this is a central paradox in the United States in our racial politics, is the exceptionalism that a lot of people present. And actually there is an ethnic studies professor named Jody Melamed who wrote a really interesting book about this in terms of racial liberalism and the rise of racial liberalism as a substitution for radical reforms for racial justice around the 1960s. Essentially, what I tend to see and envision is that liberals in the United States are very capable of seeing social problems as individualized, as engaging with the same types of sort of limitations to their empathy and lack of sort of structural awareness that we see in other cultural contexts. So I think as much as people might, say, as that one comment writer did, there's clearly something wrong with these numbers. Like, oh, we just can't figure it out. The numbers are too high. I think there are a lot of racial liberals or political liberals in the United States that would look at those numbers and say something is going on here. But I think there is a really strong aversion to the types of fundamental social change and cultural change that would be required to actually address the root causes. I think that political liberalism in the United States in particular has a very strong aversion to looking at root causes and structural change. And they might be more likely to think about it in terms of crimes, in terms of particular bad politicians, maybe even to blame it on conservatives, even though, if you look at the history of the United States, the crime bill, all of the architects of mass incarceration are firmly in power right now. Our current president in the United States wrote the crime bill, and he's considered like the most powerful liberal in the United States. And so I do think this is like a major conflict. I think it's also another way that the media is able to reduce the debate into sort of this dyad between the conservative stance and the liberal stance. And the liberal stance is maybe piecemeal reforms or maybe changing, maybe tinkering with some of the smaller policies, maybe saying, let's not have such large of disparities, but some disparities are inevitable. The conservative side is just full on, let's be more punitive, let's be more harsh. I even read things that were like people saying, we need to make prisons more difficult. We need to make drug dealers and criminals' lives worse. This real punitive animus. And I think that ends up being sort of the false choice that we're oftentimes presented with in these policy debates. And that's one of the reasons why I think the political or the practical insights that I discussed at the end of people who actually take this critical position and are advocating for things like decarceration and reparations that would actually address the scourge of mass incarceration as like one of the worst human rights violations maybe in history, I think would do a lot more to sort of benefit that. And I think that work that's happening on the ground in activist communities, in communities that are centering racial justice, is probably some of the most important work that's taking place politically. It's happening at the grassroots level. It's happening at the level of people who are personally impacted, and it is sort of applying pressure in really important ways. I think, unfortunately, we are still living in times where the dominant position that's reformist is still that liberal position that is willing to cede a lot of ground to a lot of violence. Yeah, and I think that is kind of the ultimate sort of contradiction that we do need to wrestle with is, you know, this contradiction between what America claims to represent and what it actually does. I think that's something that, you know, we continue to try to struggle with. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's a like the $1 million question. That's such a good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. It's a extremely big question, but I think you did a very good job of tackling it.
Thank you.
It reminds me a lot of Du Bois's concept of abolition democracy as well, right? Where like the whole definition of democracy and practice of democracy in the US is founded on non-democracy, both in the US and elsewhere, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, and I will also say, like, adding to that, I'll do like a little bit of a shameless plug for myself. You know, the current projects that I'm working on are explicitly dealing with some of these themes of racial politics, political inequality, and democracy. So I'm looking forward to engaging in those discussions a lot more in a broader sense. So, you know, if anyone wants to connect about those projects or ask any questions about those, we have like 5 minutes. I'd be happy to talk about some of those things as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Does anyone have any follow-up questions they want to ask? We've got around 5 minutes left. I'll just check YouTube. You got a thanks a lot and a greetings from Turkey.
Oh,
YouTube.
Thank you. I would be curious to hear what the parallels are in Turkey as well.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye to see if they
don't feel like you have to fit that in like a YouTube comment, but
there's just two things. One of them is just because, like, I guess what was so interesting as well was your ability to think about how big conceptual or cultural repertoires or racial ideologies essentially can become embodied in social policies. So, you know, you were talking about that in terms of colorblind racism and post-racialism. I was wondering how that plays out when you look at the supposed differences between decriminalization on the one hand and legalization on the other, because I know that that's been a really big issue in kind of like UK commentaries, and I was wondering how that's playing out in the United States.
In the United States, I think that it is like unique here in terms of our political system. So I think whereas, you know, things are happening more at the level of the entire nation in the UK, things are extremely rapidly changing in terms of the state level here in the US. So at the same time that, like, if I wanted to, technically, because I'm working from home right now, like, I could just start like smoking weed on camera. Nothing bad would happen, which is kind of wild to think that that's pretty extreme in terms of what we envision for drug policy. If I was in another state, particularly maybe somewhere in the deep South in the United States, I could face like up to like decades in prison for just, you know, having cannabis on my person, even just for personal use. So things have been very fragmented here in a really interesting way. And that's what's been fascinating for me to follow here, is that there are these parallel struggles taking place even in just different states. So whereas this recent reform process took place in New York, the same exact process is playing out right now in Connecticut, where activists are pushing for more radical policies. And so I think this difference between decriminalization and legalization is important, because what we recognize as social scientists is that even small fines even small forms of punishment can really add up and can really still be used to support and reinforce racial inequalities. So in states in the United States, for instance, where there's been decriminalization but not legalization, there's still massive disparities in who's being arrested, or not arrested, but ticketed for like low-level offenses, smoking cannabis in public, or underage use, or something along those lines. That when something is decriminalized, or maybe even possessing a certain amount that's beyond what's decriminalized, it still creates these spaces for carceral logic. It still creates these spaces where people want to have it both ways, where on one hand we're recognizing that the problems associated with drug use objectively and naturally are not high enough to warrant arrest and incarceration. But there still has to be some kind of way that police and the carceral state can kind of keep hooked into it. And I think there's a little bit of an interest convergence there, where I think that police and the entire sort of military industrial complex really still wants to keep its hooks in even after drug reforms have passed. I also think that a lot of people aren't viewing this through the lens of racial and social justice. And it's much more from the perspective of, well, I want to be able to use drugs that aren't super harmful, just me personally. And that's all I care about. So if it's decriminalized, that's fine too. And so that's why I think it's also important to introduce this broader systemic perspective into the debate. And yeah, but it is interesting that those terms have really been thrown around, and I'm hopeful that things go more the legalization way, obviously, in the UK.
Super interesting. And then we've got 1 minute. Something that we'd like to do is just to ask our guest speakers if there's a book or a journal article that they'd recommend to people, something that's maybe inspired you to do the research that you've done, or something that you found really interesting. Is there anything that jumps out?
Absolutely. I think one thing is Herbert Blumer's 1971 article on social problems as a process of collective definition, really influential to me. I would say also that Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and his co-authors was deeply influential to me in thinking about racial politics and media. I also want to give a shout out to some of the work that's come out of critical race theory. So like I have a bunch of copies of my book because I don't see people in person, but there are these great readers on critical race theory. And the more that I've engaged with that work, the more that I think it gives a really great theoretical framework for understanding how race and racism are embedded in law. It kind of really helped me in terms of thinking about narratives, and as you mentioned, how social ideologies become embedded in policies. So I would say those are kind of like the top 3 big influences for me.
Thanks so much. I think you may be the second person to have said Stuart Hall over the past 2 years. So it's good to see Stuart Hall starting to get a bit more of, let's say, a positive reputation in sociology rather than just cultural studies.
Absolutely.
So, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much for waking
up early
and zooming in at 7:30. It was really great to listen to.
No problem. Yeah, and I'm happy to send my slides too. I saw a comment. So I'll send my slides so people can check them out as well, peruse them at their own time. Cool.
Thanks so much, Michael.